Right. Okay. So, welcome everybody. This is episode 5 of BAMEOTUK UK Let's Talk series. Today, the topic is Let's Talk Institutional Racism in Occupational Therapy, moving from moral conversations to sustainable change actions for equity, justice, and inclusivity. Before I get the panel members to introduce themselves, I'm going to just tell you, or maybe just remind you of the World Federation statement on systemic racism, and I've abbreviated it a little bit. So it states the World Federation of Occupational Therapists condemns systemic racism and stands in solidarity with the global Black Lives Matter movement. Throughout its history, WFOT has established, led, and advocated for human rights, diversity, and cultural safety. It has also challenged and campaigned for change at a systems level, for example, strengthening its commitment to human rights with greater emphasis within education and the minimum standards for education of occupational therapists, revised 2016. But we also recognize that this is not enough. So I thought I'd have a look at what it says about racism in the minimum standards that they have published, and you can find it on the website. And the word racism comes up a couple of times under the subtopic of environment under knowledge about. So it says in these two paragraphs, paragraph 1, how aspects of the social, political, and cultural environment, such as family, friends, members of the community, non-governmental organizations, employers, teachers, affect people's participation in occupation. For example, racism, social stigma, occupational justice, and diversity. The next paragraph, how aspects of the institutional environment, such as institutional racism, apartheid, and poverty, affect people's participation in occupation, occupational deprivation, discriminatory legislation and policy, environmental, ecological, climate conditions influencing occupations. So that's where it is in the World Federation statement of occupational therapists against systemic racism. Now I'm going to come to our panel members. I wonder if you could introduce yourselves and tell us briefly a little bit about yourselves to our audience. Let me start with Juman.
Yes, thank you, Mish. I'm Juman Sim'an. I work at Canterbury Christchurch as a senior lecturer in occupational therapy. I've worked there for the last 10 years. My interest really in occupational therapy is mostly focused on the study of occupation and, if you like, occupational science, and especially the emerging ideas about science as a transformational phenomenon for society. So I'd like to think of ourselves as producing knowledge for changing society to the better. My research concern is about really marginalized communities' everyday life and how we can learn from them to inform theory and practice. And my PhD was about olive farming as a daily activity within settler colonialism and military occupation in the West Bank of Palestine. I'm really interested in the idea of how we can decolonize our profession from its historical roots in Eurocentricity and, if you can say that, I don't know, Eurocentrism, is that a word? And white supremacy and as Edward Said said, Orientalism or othering, really, which can be unintentional, but it is there in our profession and our so thank you, Mish, for providing this opportunity for me to talk about these issues, because this is really what I'm really concerned about, and I'm really excited about being here with Dave Thomas. I know Dave for some years, and I'm sure Dave will tell you a little bit more about himself, but I'm really excited with this presence. I think it's a really good gathering here today.
Thank you, Juman, and we're really happy you're here on our BAMEOTUK UK podcast as well. Dave, over to you. Could you introduce yourself?
Hi, thank you, Mish, for having me on this program. It's really a privilege and an honor to share my experiences and insights with colleagues and future professionals. So thank you very much. I'm Dave Thomas. I am an occupational therapist, and I work in a non-traditional role at the University of Kent, a role which I might add that I've shaped and fashioned for myself by using all of my skills in my occupational therapy toolbox. I'm primarily concerned with, my practice is primarily concerned with social justice. So like Juman, occupational science is broadly the remit in which I operate, but specifically social justice. So advocating for the marginalized, the oppressed. And very much so, I believe in the power of collective occupations. And I try to embark on a practice whereby I can work with individuals, communities, societies, organizations to illuminate the potential of these collective organizational in realizing sustainable transformational change. Because I think that is important. If we're going to move this agenda forward, that must be the primary objective, to work collectively and to sustain and implement transformative change. So that is me in a nutshell. My PhD is concerned with the extent to which the whiteness of the curriculum poses barriers for students from racially minoritized backgrounds participation in higher education. So specifically, the way how westernized ontologies and epistemologies shapes the experiences and interests of these students and prevents or poses barriers to them really interrogating the curriculum and participating in higher education and ultimately realizing greater attainment. So I think that's for me broadly. As I said, I'm quite happy to be here to share my knowledges and experiences, which I think is quite dynamic. I believe I'm a hybrid. Been labeled as a troublemaker, which I believe I'm in good company. Yes, I know of some esteemed persons who have been labeled troublemakers. So good trouble, I might add, as they say, as the late John Lewis says. So I'm here to make necessary and good trouble along with my fellow troublemakers.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you. Always, yes, dynamic. Always a good troublemaker. And joining us in the troublemaking is Juman as well. Do you know, I suppose I should introduce myself as well. My name is Mushrat Ahmed Landayu. I like to be called Mish. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And I always like to say my ethnicity as well. I'm British and I'm Asian Bangladeshi. I don't know if my fellow panel members would like to say their ethnicity as well and join me in that.
Well, that's I like that question, because that reminds me of a question I've been asked. It could be about 550 times so far, if I'm counting. Like, where are you from? Who are you? Right? And when they ask that question, I sometimes have to think, actually, where am I from? And I believe the more appropriate question is, where's my locality? Where do I call home now? But on a serious note, I was born in Jamaica, and I spent all of my childhood life there and more or less all of my adult life in the UK. So And well, I say broadly in the UK, I've spent some of it in Germany as well. So whilst that might be a disadvantage, I think it gives me a unique lens, in which I can, I'm operating in this liminal space, or these liminal spaces where I can see diverging perspectives and how these myriad perspectives can interact, to create a more positive future perspective. So yeah, so that's where I'm from. I identify as a Black man. And when I say a Black man, I say a man of African heritage. Um, specifically, Gold Coast of Africa, I'm told. My name in its entirety, as I have been given, is Dave St. Patrick Thomas. And as you can imagine, Dave is an English name, St. Patrick is an Irish name, and Thomas is a name of a Scottish slave owner who was very prominent in Jamaica at the time.
Wow, wow, wow. Thank you. Juman.
Dave touched on so many issues just from talking about his name and his identity, which I would love to point out, first of all, in relation to the WFOT statement. I think what's lacking there is those historical connections to institutional racism, to slavery, to colonialism, to patriarchy, to imperialism and capitalism, really. And that's really what's lacking there from that statement. Obviously, there's also the action and the pledge to action that is lacking. I would love to touch on that, but thank you. And you're touching on the intersectionality of our identities there. I'm a he and I am a him as a pronoun, if you'd like to refer to me in that way. I'm a man too. I do experience that question, where you from, and I think it's a sort of a microaggression where in my head I'd say, what do you mean? I live in Faversham, I'm from the UK. I mean, I know what they're hinting. They hear my voice, they hear my accent, obviously, and they see that I don't look like a white Englishman. And then I say, I'm Palestinian, and then they would say, after that conversation, like, I live in Faversham, but really, where are you from? They would say. I would say, I'm Palestinian, and then they'll say, does Palestine exist? Which actually, as a state, is not a recognized state. And then I would say, yes, I'm in my identity as a Palestinian from that place that doesn't exist anymore because of ethnic cleansing, because of settler colonialism and an ongoing military occupation, really. But I am a Palestinian, but I have citizenship from both countries, the UK and Israel. So in that way, I am a citizen of two countries, the UK and Israel. So it's, when you ask what's your ethnicity, it does come with a lot of package, doesn't it, Mish? And I like those conversations that this stimulates when you talk about your identity, because it really links to our discussion today, doesn't it?
Well, you know what? There was a time, and this is full disclosure, as I often do. There was a time when that question would provoke some emotion, because I was confused, where am I from? Because you're in this liminal space where you want to assimilate, you want to fit in, so you want to become fully English or British. But the reality is you don't want to relinquish your status as a Jamaican. So you find that, okay, you're not fully accepted in Britain, right? Because there's remnants of your native Jamaican tongue, which you can clearly hear, right? And then when you go back to your native land, Jamaica, on holiday, they say, and I'll say it in Jamaican, you're a foreigner, man, you're a foreigner. So you're a foreigner, right? So you're not fully accepted there either. And then you go back to your community where you grew up, and it doesn't exist anymore. Mm-hmm. It's been gentrified. That place is no longer, it's just a figment of your imagination. Yeah. So when someone says, where are you from? You think, oh my God, where am I from? Mm. Where am I from, right? So Yeah, so for me, there was a time when I grappled with that quite a lot, and I avoided that question actually. But now I'm in a better place where actually I can see the juxtapositions between the varying environments, and how I navigated those spaces, and how the identity as a Jamaican has enabled me and shaped my identity as Dave St. Patrick Thomas now, right? I can see that now, but I'm only assuming that for some people, this is quite a difficult question, very emotive question. And so, I would urge colleagues who probably don't have an understanding of this, to appreciate that this could provoke some emotions. So just be gentle and tolerant and patient, with these persons if they're not forthcoming. Now I am desperate to maintain my Jamaican tongue. If I lose that, that's me. It's over. The game is over. So when someone says, "Oh, I can hear a little bit of," I'm like, "Yes, you can hear it. Thank you," because I want to keep that, and so I know autonomically. Sometimes I speak in a non-Jamaican tongue, which I'm half and half, right? So, but yeah, so it's just to reassure anyone who feels like this that it is perfectly okay. And notice I didn't say normal. I said okay. It's perfectly okay to feel like this because there are others who feel the same way.
It takes time, doesn't it, to reconcile with your double consciousness? Didn't Dubois talk about this double consciousness that we grapple with as people who come from minorities or marginalized? Especially, he was talking about African Americans in the early 20th century, right? The ones who would like to assimilate to the white culture, but at the same time, they don't want to deny their specificity and uniqueness of their Black experience. Yeah.
And you see, I mean, I know that there's a place for this type of these experiences in clinical practice. I would encourage everyone to embrace this, and even our non-white colleagues and allies. They're fantastic, white allies who actually get it. So, learn from these people and embrace it, because if you can imagine, we are living in a society now, which is, globalization is really at its peak, right? People are moving in different spaces. So we've got a cultural interplay and interbreeding, right? We can't choose our patients. We can't. So who's to tell that another Dave Thomas isn't going to be the patient on the outpatient ward that we need to see? Who is best placed to understand his or her lived experience or their lived experiences than someone who has positionality? And as they say, in research, positionality, you need to control for the biases that comes with it. But it's also a good thing because you can empathize with this person. I know from my clinical experience that we had a patient on a ward once. She was what they call a bounce back patient. She was in and out, in and out. As soon as she was discharged, she came back and no one could figure out what was going on with her. No one could figure it out. And in this conversation, what became apparent to me was that she was lonely. She lived alone. It was Christmas. And for her, based on her heritage or Jamaican heritage, Christmas is a time when people come together and celebrate family and fellowship. And she couldn't bring herself to being alone at home without a family. So she considered being in hospital an opportunity to be around people, particularly at that time. Now, if I didn't share a common cultural background with that person, I wouldn't be able to understand that. And none of my colleagues in the team could understand that because they didn't have that positionality. So what I'm suggesting here is that you can see how this so-called outsider status can be beneficial to our efforts as healthcare professionals if it is properly recognized as authentic. So this is an authentic contribution to knowledge and to practice and to shaping practice and probably policies as well. So just in that one instance, I could have highlighted that. So yeah, I would say to anyone who's grappling with this state of double consciousness, to embrace it as a good thing, because it is a USP. It's a unique selling point. Believe me, it's a good thing. It's good trouble.
I'm still grappling with it, and I'm past 50. I'm still like born in Bangladesh, brought up in Tanzania, came to England, left England, went to the United Arab Emirates, came back to England. And like you said, Dave, I'm a foreigner when I go to Bangladesh, but I don't quite fit in the UK. And so I've decided that I'm just another cultural aspect. You know, this is, people who are the grapplers are creating another culture
The
within the
hybrid.
country.
The hybrid. I mean, I've passed the stage of trying to fit in now. I realize that I don't want to fit in anymore. I just think, like, how boring would it be, Because I want to be there for the marginalized, the ones who can't fit in. I want to be there to reassure them that you don't have to fit in. You can stand out. You've got a unique contribution to make. These stories. I don't want to. Well, I'll allow you to ask me the question, because I think this will segue straight into my answer to the questions that you'll ask.
I'm going to bring you guys back to the podcast topic, which is about institutional racism in occupational therapy. But it was so interesting. I didn't want to stop the conversation because it is part of the conversation that we're going to have, really. I'm going to start with my first question. Are you ready?
Mm-hmm.
What do we mean by institutional racism in occupational therapy? Juman, start with you.
Yes, I mean, I would say something like intended or unintended structural biases that are based on ideology of white supremacy or Eurocentrism, or in the case of the Arab Muslim West is Orientalism, as Edward Said has eloquently described. It's about really othering without noticing, really, in our structures and in our institutions. This could be experienced in things like policy and regulations, could be expressed, in service provision. But what I'm really interested in is how it's expressed in education and training of occupational therapists, but also in our epistemologies, our theories and models of practice and interventions. But also, this institutional racism in occupational therapy can be expressed in team or organization structures or cultures, and also the day-to-day interactions with professionals and the public. So really, it comes in lots of forms, really, and lots of colors. But it's this thing that we might be doing unintentionally or intentionally, and it's based on historical roots, as I said earlier, of colonialism, patriarchy, capitalism, and the slave trade, really, in the last 500 years of Western history, really. Does that kind of answer your question, Mish?
Yes, and more. I'm going to ask Dave, not that same question. I'm going to ask Dave question 2, which is, what has been the consequences and outcomes of occupational therapy students and service users as a consequence of institutional racism in occupational therapy?
Well, I mean, that is a broad, a loaded question, but I'll attempt to disaggregate it a bit and just consume it in parts, right? So I believe, based on the eloquent description that Juman just provided, I want to highlight the collective failure. So the aspect of that is collective failure, and this could be unwitting, right? So this could be knowingly or unwittingly, and the way that is detected in the processes and attitudes and behaviors and policies as well, right? So how is this operationalized? So let me constrain this in testimonial injustice. So we know about epistemic injustice by way of the curriculum and by way of the occupational therapy curriculum in particular. So this is how the distributive unfairness in respect to the epistemic goods, such as education, is operationalized, right? So how is education distributed unfairly to then impact on policies, processes, practices in clinical practice, right? How is it? I think it is distributed unfairly through testimonial injustice. And that is when prejudice causes a hearer to give a sort of deflated level of credibility to the spoken word. So I know Miranda Fricker talks about that. So testimonial injustice, where Dave Thomas's word is given a diminished standing because he doesn't know anything. So even if he's a practitioner of high repute, excellent practitioner, he doesn't know anything. He's a learner who, you know, has an appetite and an aptitude. He doesn't know anything. In the curriculum, we're not seeing non-Westernized thinkers. We're not seeing thinkers from the global South within the curriculum because they don't know anything. You know, occupational therapy basically should be, it should be based on the thoughts of Westernized thinkers, or should it not? We don't know. So testimonial injustice, right? And then we talk about hermeneutical injustice. So when this gap in collective interpretive resources, it puts someone at an unfair disadvantage when it comes to making sense of what's going on, right? So our populations, they don't have the collective interpretive resources to understand the social experiences because of this gap in knowledge, because of this one-dimensional presentation of these knowledges. So for example, how can instances of microaggressions and racism still be operationalized in higher education? So based on the idea of the hermeneutical injustice, is because we have a society that still sees that as normal. You know, Gloria Ladson-Billings talks about this when she talks about critical race theory as racism as normal, a normal part of functioning in society. So that is why, you know, if we see these epistemic injustices, it is okay. We don't have to do anything about it because that is normal. And this is because we're not presented with enough resources and not recognizing these resources as authentic to redress that disparity in thinking. So I will say, if you start from the foundations where you're flawed, of course, when you get up to clinical practice, you know, we'll have these unwitting or deliberate prejudices being operationalized, because that is just how it works. You know, that's a pipeline of discrimination, if you want to call it that, a pipeline of injustice. So we need to break that chain, I believe.
Oh, break the pipeline of injustice. Yes, Dave, that's a biggie. That's a biggie. Do you have anything to add to that, Jim, and the sort of the consequences of institutional racism in occupational therapy on students and eventually service users, because we output the professionals who are impacted by it?
I mean, yeah, I mean, I hear a lot of racism in placements. You know, students go out there and they experience those microaggressions, but actually downright racist attitudes towards them from practice educators and we heard really some experiences in your previous video cast, didn't we, Mish, from those wonderful women and men practicing occupational therapy in the UK. There is, you know, it is expressed in occupational therapy in the very low representation in academic and leadership positions of Black and people of color, really, and in the so-called attainment gap that is very well known and well published really in the UK. I don't like the word attainment gap because it blames the individual for that. But really, this is about also our curriculum and criteria for progression for students based on this neoliberal positivist methods that really are also an expression of institutional racism. In terms of service users, I think blaming them for the health inequalities they suffer from. I have examples of traveler communities or migrants and refugees here in the UK that don't really have access to services, but we keep blaming them for not being healthy enough or not doing the things that really assimilate to what we think they should be doing. Or any people who are living in a communal life way, and the interdependence there rather than independence is their really value of how they live. And we see them in occupational therapy as uncooperative or uncompliant, or they don't, we have so many names for those clients that we see or service users we see, because we're with our attitudes, we think, and our kind of very ethnocentric way of looking at it from the theory and the models of practice we learned, we look at them as something else than what they really are, because instead of learning their communal interdependent way of living or actually getting them to represent themselves the way they want to, we project into them what we think they ought to know. And I think that's really part of institutional racism in occupational therapy.
Yeah, do you know, while you were saying that, I just had a kind of flashback to when I was a clinician, and I felt really guilty because there was a person and a Asian guy, and he wasn't eating. So I got my mum to make him some dal and roti to bring to him because he didn't like the dal and the Asian food that was happening. And he lived on his own. He didn't really have anybody. I felt so guilty that I brought him food, that I did it so secretly because I thought it was the wrong thing to do. And I it's just taken me back to that,
Yeah.
and it's reminding me of Dave's example of the lady who was kept coming back because there was something culturally not being met for her, and that idea of she needed to have that social environment for that period, Christmas time, to make it feel like that was her, living, not existing, and she was doing it by coming back into the hospital. And I was just thinking, why did I feel guilty? Well, because I'd internalized that normal racism. I'd internalized it. And so now it's like, you can't show your difference and you can't help someone, even though you understand what's happening culturally. You got to hide it, And it just reminded me of that. And I can remember now, like post-traumatic stress disorder, how my heart was beating and I was like, oh, I've bought you some food, don't tell anybody. I heated it up and I put it on there and I pulled the curtain around pretending he was having therapy so he could have some food. But yeah, it's those things. And like Dave, you said, there's someone who knew that lady, so you understood and you were able to provide that experience she needed for her well-being. And I was doing the same, but feeling very guilty about it.
Yeah, I think it's like, for me, it's reimagining what the curriculum, or in fact the service, could look like. For me, that's the thing that motivates me. I'm always, because I'm a dreamer, right? I'm always reimagining what could it look like in an ideal world. And I know it's, if you accept that intersectionality is really a mechanism that will will really impact on that reimagination. And then we look at how we can collectively create knowledge and knowledges to support that reimagination. So I think for me, those are the things that really, really, keep me going. I know that you don't know what you don't know. And the power is in the resources that the profession certainly has at hand. The resources, the finest resources are the people. So I know at the moment there's a problem with recruiting people from diverse backgrounds in our profession. But I also know that we still have some amount of diversity there. So we have to harness the power of that diversity. And until as a profession, we understand that that's our biggest asset, I think we'll be in a static state. So the power of that diversity, the power of those resources, the power is in the people. You upskill the people and ensure that the people's stories, this type of testimonial injustice is redressed, where the people's stories are now accepted as authentic narratives that contribute positively to the body of knowledges that we are bringing forward. I think that is a really, really powerful thing. There's some power in that, because you never lose of people. You only learn, right? You never lose with people. You learn, whether you learn positively or negatively, but there's no losses there. I think in terms of the curriculum specifically, it is important to embed a type of cultural sensitivity in that curriculum. Very, very important, because we have to admit that in our courses, in our programs, in our universities, we have people from a diverse range of backgrounds consuming this curriculum. And so how is diversity present in the curriculum? How is it represented in a positive way? How does it encourage students to develop the critical consciousness and the socio-political awareness to challenge power? And then ultimately, how does that promote inclusive interactions, both in the university setting and broadly in our settings, in our workplaces? So what I'm saying here is that the curriculum is the pathway to that greater development of diversity. And if we can harness that, as they say, the cradle to the grave. So that's the cradle, right? If we can harness that from the cradle upwards, and then match that top down with stronger, more robust policies and processes and practices that recognizes the power of diversity, not in a performative way, but operationalizing it in a manner that respects and represents the population. Yes, we know in the UK, according to the census, 86% of the population is white. We know that, but there's an increasing number of persons from diverse backgrounds in our societies. So I believe that we have to name it, we have to call it, and until we're ready to actually name the thing that's bothering you, arrive at a diagnosis. Until we arrive at a diagnosis, we can't develop a treatment plan, right? We have to name it. We have a problem collectively with this thing called institutional racism. Whiteness, not whiteness as in people, but whiteness as an ideology. We have to collectively, as a human race, as a society, understand that it's our problem. It's not a black or brown problem. It's a problem for everyone. And if everyone is not winning, everyone will lose. So it's everyone. We need all hands on board to fix this thing, to address this thing. So we name it, we diagnose it, and as part of the treatment plan, everyone needs to be on board. We're stronger together, I think.
Yes, yeah. Back to that Ubuntu. Back to Ubuntu, definitely stronger together. And yeah, I think that's true. It's not just about BAME persons in occupational therapy, whether it's staff or students. It's everybody. It's white allies as well. It's everybody joining in. Because as a strong collective, as a large collective, that's how we're going to break the cycle or start to chip away at it, if not break it completely. I'm going to go on to question 3. What is the way forward to disrupt institutional racism in occupational therapy? Juman.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and I haven't really yet made my mind whether, as Audre Lorde says, do we use the master's tool that will never dismantle the master's house, or do we go beyond that and outside that to work on dismantling racism? And in that way, I don't know if I believe enough in that institution of occupational therapy to enable it as something that could really change. And I think people started working on that in books such as An Occupational Therapy Without Borders, and they have actually discussed that in their second edition, whether we should really change the name and change the institution, the profession. They have come to a conclusion. I'm not sure why it's not the time yet to change, but they did call it occupational therapies rather than just one occupational therapy. And it's a way to start, I think. But I think we really also need to work outside of institutions such as ARCOT or WFOT, or actually what we call occupational therapy or HCPC and HCPC. I really don't believe in those institutions that are based on lots of oppressive systems, such as neoliberal capitalism that actually oppresses more than liberates. And I think as occupational therapists, or as I call myself sometimes, an occupational justice practitioner or agent of change or an activist. I'm a social activist, and I think we should invite occupational therapists or students of occupational therapy to join all other activists to really work on decolonizing society as a whole. And that means that work of redistribution of power, reparation, reclamation of land and resources. I think that's where we need to head. We need to really learn from marginalized communities the way they fight and struggle against inequalities, and how we can help within our occupational lens really to dismantle those injustices in society. So I think we really need to go communal, interdependent, to consider the more than humans, the animals, the trees, the mountains, nature. I think we need to consider solidarity, or as you call it, Ubuntu, or in Palestine we call it Auna. I talk in my work about this concept of everyday resistance. How can we join communities to resist in their daily living the oppressions and the occupational injustices of all its type? And I think this idea of change agents, I think the Canadians done really well since 2012. They got into the competencies of the register. Students need to qualify with that as a skill of being change agents. That idea that we really need to learn the skills of how we can collaborate with grassroots communities to dismantle everyday injustices. And that's where I see the future of what you may call now occupational therapy. But I think we really need to have this discussion. Is occupational therapy the way it is, the way it's called, the way it's institutionalized? Can we change it within, or can you change it with, kind of really work from outside? But maybe both ways are the way forward. That's how we should start. I don't know what you think of that, Dave. I don't think we've ever had this discussion before. By the way, Dave did training in Canterbury Christchurch, so I had the privilege of working with Dave as an occupational therapy student. So that's how much history we've got with Dave. And Dave really comes and speaks to my students, the third-year students, in my module Critical Occupational Focused Practice, which really centers the idea of occupational justice as a way forward, and this occupational consciousness and collective occupation, everyday forms of resistance. We get people from the community to talk to us about their experience of marginalization. We get people from LGBTQ communities, from service users communities, refugee communities come to talk to us about their experience, and I get students to go and do field visits to those community projects to learn and contribute, but also transform as people of color, but also white students. We all need to commit to decolonizing our society. So I think that's the way forward, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think Juman, you're being too generous. What Juman doesn't tell us is that he was my teacher. So he was one of my teachers, you know, who inspired me to think beyond the surface. I remember, Juman, you were the person who presented those 20 recommendations from Peggy McIntosh, the invisible knapsack. So I remember that distinctly. So I you know, I never got a chance to thank you for that, but that was, I think that was a key ingredient in my formation as a troublemaker. So thank you very much for that. But yes, Jamal was.
But you didn't reintroduce that to my students. You know, you offered that to my students now. So it's kind of the circles is closed. You know,
exactly.
You're yeah.
People like Jaman and Raya Gould and Ian Marsh. You know, those people were at the forefront of shaping my thoughts as an occupational therapist. But what I would say is that, for my thoughts on the ways forward, I will also, as Juman did in the beginning, I'll draw on Audre Lorde, a small quote when she said, "Your silence will not protect you because you were never meant to survive." It's not about survival. So I would say that to organizations and institutions. Your silence will not protect you. You're never meant to survive. It's not about survival. What you need to do now is to act. So invitations to treat no longer will protect any organization. We are at a critical point in history right now. We are creating history as we speak. We've seen the new critical consciousness, you know, catalyzed by the events of the last 7-8 months, certainly the last 9 months, I would say. So we've seen that. You know, we haven't seen these events in our lifetime. But because we're now at this critical moment, I think it's a massive opportunity for any organization or any individual who is really serious about making a solid contribution and change. Performative measures, it will not protect you anymore because people are more, you know, they're desensitized now. We can see it now. Everyone can see everyone now. So what I'm suggesting here is that we need these to be enacted, and we need to see, you know, collective action. So for example, if an organization is putting out a statement that they're non-racist, it means that they might need to reframe that statement and saying that they're anti-racist. But if you're putting out a statement and saying that you're anti-racist, I think every organization needs to ask themselves, why is there a need to put out that statement? You know, why do you need to put out a statement to justify something that you're already doing? What is the value in that? I believe the statements shouldn't signify action. What we need now, like, you know, I've spoken about this before, about having a type of race equality receipt, you know, where you demonstrate, show me the evidence of what you've done. You know, similar to, as I said before, you go to a supermarket and you're walking out with a trolley full of goods and the door bleeps. The security guard is going to ask you for your receipt. There's nothing else that will save you. The silence won't save you, nothing else. At that point, you need the receipts as proof of purchase. So what I'm saying is, institutions and organizations at this critical moment, this juncture in our history, will need to start showing these receipts. And what does that receipt look like? For example, if we are truly interested in positive action, i.e. Equality Act, Section 158 or 159, I believe, right? Are we in a position as an organization to ensure that we redress the pipeline, the career pipeline, and promote more or produce more academics from the global south? Can we do that? Because we don't see many of those academics in our teaching staff, right? In our occupational therapy programs. How do we do this? Can we employ sections 158 and 159 of the Equality Act to say, you know what, we will develop some scholarships specifically for those underrepresented groups, those underserved students, to ensure that they progress to postgraduate studies, and then from there transition to substantive contracts, you know, as occupational therapy lecturers. Can we do that? Can we develop scholarships and grants to attract these people? That could be something that could end up on your race equality receipt. This is my receipt. This is what I've done. I've employed the sections 158 and 159 of the Equality Act to promote participation for that underrepresented and underserved group through positive action. This is what we've done. You get a tick and you move forward. Let's see the other receipt. Can the other receipt be, we recognize the voices and the experiences of marginalized communities and groups and underserved professionals as the Royal College of Occupational Therapists. And what we will do, we will conduct another piece of research, which we'll commission. We'll write a report to capture the narratives of these voices. And as part of the recommendations, we looked at our policies and ensure that they reflect the diversity of our workforce. So not just another inquiry, not just another report to put on the shelf, but actively look at the policies, processes, and practices that may unwittingly maintain those structural systems of inequality. Could we do that as a regulatory body and have that on our race equality receipt as a demonstration? Because the statement is there. That is just the invitation. That's the shopping list. The statement is on the shopping list. On the receipt will be the action that you've taken. As I said, for me, there is a real value right now to recognize that we have an opportunity. As a society, we have an opportunity to act with due diligence. Are we committed enough to act and demonstrate these acts as part of our receipt, as proof that we've acted? Or are we still going to be silent and thinking that the silence is going to save us? Because you're not going to survive. You know, as I said, it's a community. This is collectively, we need to create an environment where everyone can grow, learn, develop, and most importantly, feel a sense of belonging. I think that is the critical one.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you for that detailed discussion. Actually, it makes me think like I want to go back to that, to the ARCOT statement, actually. Because on the back of the WFOT statement and BAMEOTUK UK's open letters, they did eventually come out with a statement. Actually, I'm going to read it to you guys. So it came out on the 24th of June 2020 after BAMEOTUK UK open letter about how they felt that they weren't recognizing what was going on in the world and not really looking at themselves either. The Royal College then responded. The Royal College of Occupational Therapists fully supports the statement from the World Federation of Occupational Therapists on standing in solidarity with the global Black Lives Matter movement and condemning systemic racism. The statement issued on the 19th of June 2020 outlines that systemic racism is an abuse of human rights and addressing it needs to be a global majority. And they carry on like this. There's nothing about a receipt, getting involved in a receipt or anything like that. Nowhere in any of this is there any uncomfortable discussion about the organization itself and how it's contributed to institutional racism and its consequences on its members and the citizens they serve. It's all away from them. And I think your discussion just reminded me of all that and how BAME OT UK was tussling with all the stuff that was coming up, because they didn't put us in that statement. They put us in another page on an EDI statement saying that they were really happy for the critical friend open letter from BAMEOTUK UK, but really hadn't responded to that in a way that meant they heard what was said in the letter. So it just made me think about all of that.
You see, one of the things, Mish, one of the things is, if we can accept, and I think we have a consensus. There's a consensus here that some communities have been underserved. I believe there's a consensus globally that some communities are underserved. I also think that there's a consensus in occupational therapy education that some students are underserved. And so if we can build from that consensus upwards, having been underserved, we've inadvertently or unwittingly, I will say, promoted a form of inequality for those groups. So there is something to be said about a reparation that needs to happen, a process of reparation. And as part of reparations, I believe there should be an acknowledgement, you know, of harm that was done. But reparation go a little bit further than an acknowledgement. Reparations has to come with a measure of redress. It has been done. I'm very sorry, and we want to do something to try to repair the damage. It might not, you know, what value does this have? It might not be a fiscal value that's appropriate, but you have acknowledged that there is some harm that has been done. You have offered to make reparations, and you are willing to make reparations and move the agenda forward. But if someone says, well, Dave, I've inadvertently underserved you, but just get over it, there's a problem with that. You know, there is a problem with that. So what I'm suggesting here is a process of reparation, and collaboration is a beautiful thing. I believe, or regulatory bodies, they have an opportunity now to work with the communities that have been underserved. That is important. Work with the communities, develop synergies. For example, BAMEOTUK UK, develop synergies with these groups because they have the lived experiences. They have the lacerations, some of them invisible, but they bear the scars on a daily basis. So how can you understand the lived experiences if you are not learning these experiences from the people who are living the experiences? So I would say in shaping the policies, there's an opportunity now to work very, very closely with these underserved communities to develop these practices and policies. You know, it has to be part of the reparation process. And that for me represents real serious change, you know, real necessary trouble, as I would say. Working with communities, working with people, working with organizations, working together and showing that actually through collaboration, we can move this agenda forward. But making reparations in that way is really, really important.
Yeah, I mean, again, all of this is really well put, Dave, and yeah, I'm still not very sure about, you know, whether it is useful to work within the institution, or should we take things the matter into our hands and show the way of how to do it. Unfortunately, we work within a system where we have to pay mortgages and we have to have income from institutions such as Canterbury Christchurch University, which is so ingrained in that system as well. And, you know, I would love to unplug myself from all those institutions and be able to self-determine with my community to enable those reparations and decolonization work really without having to be part of an institution. But unfortunately, we are in this reality. And yes, I can't believe that they have not come back to the body of the BAME occupational therapists to actually say, okay, let's work together. How can we do that? They haven't come up with a pledge to, for instance, you asked I don't know if you're going to ask your last question, Mish. Maybe I should wait. But one of the things could be, do you want to ask that? And I could.
No, I just wanted to say that Arcot did come back to us, and
Okay.
we did have a discussion, but it was about keeping us at arm's length, away as a distant critical friend instead of a close partnership. And it was always about, you give us information. There wasn't anything coming our way. It was like, oh, you give us information and keep giving us information. So again, we felt like that kind of what did you call it, injustice. What was the injustice you called it, Dave? Epistemic injustice. It was just like constantly giving, we know you've got the lived experience, so tell us what to do, and not really thinking about it. Like they've done an EDI policy, and we said openly, now you're just giving us a consultation position instead of a co-production. Like, let's look at this and work together on developing an EDI policy that is inclusive and anti-racist. And we know EDI is a broad church, not just about racism. But wouldn't it be a great idea to BAMEOTUK UK was so willing to come and work with that, but no, they just kept us at a distance. They did, really, BAMEOTUK UK did force their hand into advertising for an EDI position. That was a plus for us. They did do that, but they just keep us at arm's length, and it's just we're fatigued actually with that. We smile at them and we're polite, but we just feel the injustice of the continual, you tell us, give us, and we'll just take it and we'll keep you as far away as possible. Instead of, here's a group that's really willing and active to engage with you. We are your critical friends. We want to get into those uncomfortable discussions with you. But no, it's just keep us at a distance constantly.
It's
and we feel it.
uncomfortable.
We were fatigued. And David said, we're feeling the fatigue because there's no change happening. Or little change happening, and more, epistemic exploitation and more work.
Extraction. They just want to extract knowledge from us without actually acknowledging the collaboration, and actually we need a reward for that. My problem with EDI positions is just one person, and if they fail to achieve anything, it will be blamed on them. Even if it's a person of color, I don't think this is the way forward, really. The way forward is actually to look at the roots of the issues and to collaborate and cooperate, but reward those people who you're collaborating with in ways that acknowledge their work, and be committed fully, because, if equality improves the lives of everyone. And I think that's the way forward in terms of, really, we need, exactly, it's a collective effort.
I definitely think it's a collective effort. And there's always a power imbalance, and there's people in power, and you need to collaborate with them because they are the people who can in the end make the changes. That's just the way of the world. But we can flatten the structure of the hierarchy so they're more accessible. And that's the collective action can happen much better when it's a flattened hierarchy. But that's what my PhD, it's got nothing to do with any of this. It's to do with service improvement. But actually, when I look at it, and I've been in what I've written in my chapters, I'm talking about emancipation, I'm talking about flattening structure, I'm talking about collective action. So those things are already
Yes,
in my
yes,
head
yes.
and coming out in my chapters. But a,
It's
a,
about it's
a,
about Mish. When you say flattening, I think that is so correct, because decolonization is around, one of the fundamental aspects is the redistribution of power. This idea that power is the thing that, the golden thread that runs through all of these tentacles, right? And if you can redistribute the power, then we can introduce more, a more diverse range of practices and processes and scholarship. But that is the thing. Power is such a thing. Who wants to relinquish power, right? And the problem with decolonization is it's uncomfortable. And if you're not ready to feel uncomfortable, you have to leave that one alone. You have to give that one a miss, because it requires you to really reflect and be willing to, to fragment some of the sort of paradigms that you held true. Who is willing to relinquish that and flatten that power structure? It's a hard thing, though. Can the gatekeepers open the gate just a little bit and let some, a different group of people in? What's the fear? Can you imagine if you let these people in? They'll start writing about anything and publishing everything. So I think those are some serious questions that our organizations need to really ask themselves before they even think about, embarking on this process and writing these statements. Are you really seriously ready to relinquish some of this power? Because it's become so normative. You've had this forever, right? This power and this privilege, and it's uncomfortable to relinquish it. In a similar way, it's uncomfortable for people who are suppressed by this power.
yeah, definitely well put. It's I know. I'm just thinking my service improvement PhD's got a lot of intersectionality with what we're talking about. And I will be getting into uncomfortable discussions with my research site. If they ever listen to this podcast, they know it already. I'm going to go into question 4. As Juman said, I'm going to ask that question, Juman. I'm going to go to you after I've asked that question. In the coming year, that's next year, 2021. By the end of that year, what do you want to see happen in occupational therapy? In relation to this conversation we've been having around institutional racism in occupational therapy. Juman.
Yeah, I would like to see our institutions, whether it's higher education institutions, whether it's services, health and social care services, NGOs that we work within, or the ARCOT, or Health and Care Professionals Council, to kind of listen more, really collaborate more, maybe have a body, a collective that is aiming to dismantle institutional racism within occupational therapy. Maybe more leadership and representation of people of color. I'm not sure about the BAME concept, to be honest with you, because it is a concept that is enforced on us by the white dominant culture. I'd like to think of us as people of color. I would like to see more representation in academic position, in leadership positions, in commissioning positions and services. That's if we are working within the master's tools and the master's house. I would love to continue working without those tools and those houses, and continue my activism and our activism within our communities as well. So kind of that parallel worlds. But yeah, I think listening more. I don't know how you would measure that listening, or the formation of a body, of a collective, to target that dismantling racism and decolonizing our profession, but more representation as well.
Yeah, I think I want to sort of say I want to go beyond listening, and I tell you why. Dave, were you at the HCPC EDI forum today? Were you there? Now, I thought there was interesting discussions going on today there, and I feel like they're opening up to this uncomfortable conversations, and hopefully they will get to the point well that they'll have actions that will demonstrate their receipt, as Dave calls it. But I thought they're much better at opening up to the uncomfortable discussions, and there's a diversity of people in there. You know, not just academics, not just clinicians, a diversity of people in there as well. And I saw some students there as well. So it's really an interesting conversation in that. Okay, there's listening going on, there's uncomfortable discussions going on, and there's an inching towards change action happening as well. So I think for me personally, I feel that, and I'm sure you both feel that there's been a lot of conversations happening over the years, uh, before our births as well, and but
Yeah,
there just need to be more
yeah,
meaningful
yeah, yeah.
actions.
I mean,
I don't know, what do
conversation
you
is
think?
something, yeah, conversation is something different from listening, really. Real listening is that listening that commits to action, really. The listening that commits to change. But yeah, you're right. You're right. It is about time to commit to change. Absolutely.
Dave, over to you.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with both of you. But I think push it a step further. I believe there should be a harvesting of the low-hanging fruits. I think there are some really low-hanging fruits that these organizations can harvest certainly in the next 12 months, right? So if we harvest the quick wins, what are these quick wins? Quick wins could be things like, and I keep saying this because it's the legislation that has been implemented, but reminding colleagues of the legal imperatives. So it's the legal imperatives, right? Legally, what are you supposed to be doing? Because I think, as a society, we've lost focus of this. So legally, there are some legislation that are in place that mandates that you should take the necessary steps to promote equality of opportunity and promote good relations between all your employees and all the people that you serve. That is just a basic. That's a baseline. Are we doing that? And another low-hanging fruit is we can see pipeline blockages. Are we trying to redress these? Are we trying to redress power? Juman mentioned about having people from diverse backgrounds in senior leadership positions, but I push that forward a bit in decision-making positions, because you need to be in positions to make decisions for it to become effective, right? And those are really, really quick, easy wins. It sounds difficult, but it's not. And then I would want to say, yes, I agree with the idea of listening, because that is important. And being uncomfortable listening, that is part of growth, right? A process of knowing what you don't know and acknowledging that you didn't know. So really opening up these avenues where people from these underserved communities and groups can get a chance to be heard, without judgment or fear of reprisal or repercussions. That is important in every aspect, because you won't learn about their experiences unless you give them an opportunity to teach you about these experiences, to tell you. I think the healing comes from making the reparations, and that needs to be considered seriously. So I know that budgets are tight now for all organizations for obvious reasons, but actually an organization will act if there's an interest convergence. So I would also say matching, these intentions with resources. You can, organizations can. But for OT specifically in the next 12 months, I would want the discipline to have a look at its representation. So I know I did some research over the summer where I wanted to ascertain the demographic characteristics of the members who were registered with one group, one regulatory body. The information wasn't online. I couldn't access that information online. And credit to the organization, I contacted them directly, told them my intentions, and they sent me some data. So I was able to analyze that data and present it accordingly. But I would want to say that these data should be present online for everyone to see, right? As part of this due diligence process. That's a quick, easy win. That can happen in 12 months. Because people want to, if you think about it, as part of informed consent, a student is enrolling on a post-secondary education course. They want to understand, what would it look like for me as a professional having graduated with my degree? So if you're showing data on degrees awarded, you're showing DELI data on destination of leavers 6 months after graduation, you also need to mirror that with data on what it looks like in practice. Currently, your registrants, what do they look like? That's a quick, easy win. That's a lower hanging fruit. And then now people have, they have a holistic picture where they can make an informed sort of decision whether I want to register on an occupational therapy undergraduate course, or I want to do public health, or I want to do plumbing, or whatever I want to do, But I think, yes, from a neoliberal perspective, that probably works, but it suits everyone's purposes, right? So I think, yeah, there are some low-hanging fruits, and identifying these fruits might have to come through discussion with the underserved communities as well. This is part of the listening, but definitely they need to be harvesting these fruits.
Mm-hmm.
Juman, do you want to add anything?
No, I mean, yeah, Dave said it all. I think what you're referring to, Dave, is transparency, isn't it? That, that transparency that we all have to have in order to, learn about what we can offer that is different, that could be representing all the communities we serve. Really, in the end of the day, we want to make our profession more inclusive, don't we, to all experiences, and we're able to offer interventions to all communities. So that's really where the starting point should be. From that, we're making our profession more inclusive and more impactful, if you like. I'm not talking about impact factors or quantitative, outcome measures. I'm really talking about being able to change society, and that's the kind of the social change role of occupational therapy as a profession, really. And that's where I would go, really, in the next 12 months, really, just to talk about how we can improve ourselves to be agents of change in society.
Thank you. That sounds like a place to end our podcast. But before we end, I'd just like to say this has been such a brilliant conversation, to be able to talk openly with peers. And I'm hoping maybe next time we could get some students involved as well. Just to have that freedom to speak without being judged or someone defending, because they've personalized what you're talking about. You're talking about a construct, an ideology, and the consequences of it. And I think, Professor Eli Elwani Ramagondo, I'm sorry if I said her name
No,
wrongly.
you said it right.
She talks about this in that in the WFOT 2018 conference. She talks about how occupational therapists have to identify and acknowledge the white supremacist outcome on the profession, and this will help them to heal. And then once they start to heal, they'll be able to effectively heal and be part of the change for those marginalized communities. If they don't acknowledge what's going on, and I think both you and Dave have said that, then nothing will change. And her hope, she says in her speech, in the next 100 years of occupational therapy, it should be seen that it has kept to its underpinning principle of social justice, equity, and inclusion, and protected these founding principles, never taking humanity for granted, but seeking interactions for decoloniality, so that justice for all can be achieved. And I think Angela Davis adds on to that in a way when she says we have to talk about liberating minds before we can liberate society. And she says, you know, the idea of freedom as a construct is inspiring, but what does it mean? It means you are free in a political sense. But if you have no food, what does that mean about freedom? Does that mean it's freedom to starve? So we've got so many different things going on, and we have to understand the concepts that we're talking about, how it relates to us, and how we can heal before we can start to heal others as a therapeutic profession. So I'm going to, I'm not going to end there. Dave's
quickly.
going to say something.
Yeah, quickly. I think what has been so refreshing here is that we're three professionals from three different backgrounds, but the similarity or the common thread is that we have, I would say, a dual perspective, so dual realities. So we understand the British culture, and we understand our native culture, and we can see the juxtapositions. We can use these juxtapositions to reimagine what a hybrid would look like. And I think that is missing, you know. So you mentioned about the decolonizing, and I think that it's happened here, you know. Chinua Achebe speaks about decolonizing the mind, right? I think our minds, we already understand what it looked like. We've unpacked it, you know. We've dismantled sort of the Western ideologies and introduced the ideologies from the global South. So I think that is something that, you know, we could bequeath that to some of our colleagues. You know, that could be our gift to the profession, because that is the direction the profession needs to be at, as you rightfully say. But we need more of these podcasts, Mish, where more people with these, you know, realities can bring their ideas and their experiences to the fore. And it's cathartic as well. It is cathartic. I've enjoyed this, you know, my healing is a continuous process anyway. So yeah, so thank you so much. Thank you very, very much for having me on this panel.
No, thank you to you both for coming today. And I'm going to ask that Jiman and Dave, if you could bring your chests forward to the camera and show us what is written, those logos on your t-shirts. Come on, Jiman, bring that t-shirt forward.
Here we go.
What is it?
Yes, thank you. And on that note, we shall end.